Which moment makes a man? 'Cause I'm hoping it just begins.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Robert Groves, your host for the Groves Connection podcast. The Groves Connection brings you intimate conversations with pundits, providers, patients, leaders, and lay people, all to help us understand a contradiction. How can our healthcare system be both magnificent and yet so deeply flawed? We're going inside healthcare to talk candidly with those who know. What they have to say may delight, surprise, frustrate, or at times even anger you. But I invite you to get curious and listen to the truth about healthcare and those who want to fix it. Maybe the answers have been there all along. We just need to make the connection. Are you ready to connect? Dr. Lisa Strohman, welcome to the Groves Connection.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you who haven't read the blurb, Dr. Strohman has distinguished herself in expertise around technology addiction and the impact on individuals. And she has been on the Washington Post and CNN and CBS and NBC, Forbes, Fox, Dr. Drew, any place you haven't been. It's really an amazing list here. And certainly during the pandemic, I'm sure some of that went up. But I don't want to start there. I want to start with where you grew up and what it was like growing up for you. And then we're going to delve into one of the biggest challenges that we have in our healthcare system, and that is the interplay between payer, patient, and provider, and something that we lovingly call prior authorization. But before we go there, tell us about where you grew up and what it was like as a kid for you.
Well, it's a long journey when we start there, but I grew up in Northern California. My dad was a state worker. He's a bureau chief for the Department of Justice, so was in the forensic world. My parents got divorced very early. I was about 5, I think, when they split. He went on, he's been married 8 times, and I'm happy to say that I think he's going to stick with this last one. But it was a tumultuous childhood, to say the least. So I spent half my time with my dad, which was a very kind of, middle class upbringing, 50% of the time. And then with my mom would kind of run the streets quite literally. And we were homeless for a large majority of that. And so I kind of went in between these two worlds and had to seek out teachers and nonprofit organization directors and places to kind of find safe haven on my own. So I kind of bootstrapped my life in some respect, and I found out that school was a safe place for me. So I decided to dive in there.
Yeah. So that is it sounds very challenging, honestly. And, particularly the part about being homeless at a very young and impressionable age. And I wonder, I've had Paul Conti on the show before, a psychiatrist that's both, I think it was Hopkins, and no, maybe it's Harvard and Stanford trained. That's what it is. So he got both sides of the equation. And he talks about the impact of those kinds of traumas on how we develop into adults. Do you think about that? Do you think about the influence that has had on you? And what would you share about how that has shaped your approach to life and your outlook on life? How did you overcome that and become who you are today?
Yeah, I think I know Conti's work and I'm impressed by it. I think we talk about kind of adverse childhood events, or ACEs. That's a scale from 1 to 10. I think when I took it, I scored a 9. And I think if you look in the research, there's about a 3. Once you hit a 3 or a 4, people kind of tend to write off those kids as though they may not be able to make it. It was fascinating. It's fascinating when you hear my story or my story, and then I start sharing and talking about this with others. There's a lot of really successful people that have a high ACE score, and I think
Yeah.
it does develop that resilience. You have to kind of go through trouble and difficulty in order to become resilient. It's not just a gift that you're born with. So I think that some of the challenges I would have liked to have avoided.
Yeah.
But I think that it made me who I am, and it made me decide to dedicate my everything I've done in my life has been surrounded by children and advocacy for and others. Somebody showed up for me, and I try to show up for others.
Yeah, yeah, and I, it's interesting that the difference between the kids that are forever hobbled by an experience like that, by adverse childhood events, and the kids that overcome that and become successful. And I don't know what the secret is there. I think in my case, I had one parent that was very loving and very supportive, and was always there for me in one way or another. But for kids who don't have at least that, I don't know how they get by, how they make it work. Did you have one parent that was supportive?
I did. Well, I had a grandmother. So
yes.
the most brilliant thing that I think that my father did was to bring her in home. And so for 12 years, she was kind of my steward on and off in my life. So I talk about the power of one in all of my speeches, like when I'm speaking. Because I think, it's most recent. Since last year, actually, my diagnosis, I thought I should probably start sharing the story of this.
Let's go ahead and talk about that. Yeah.
But the power of one to me is, I'm not ashamed by anything that happened to me. And I'm quite literally grateful for the people that have shown up in my life. And so I'm now starting to talk more publicly about kind of those childhood challenges and how do we shift that and use that for others and help them understand you could be that one for someone.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what? I love that. That's a great way of thinking about it. And it really, I didn't think about it in exactly that way, but it really only takes one. I was fortunate enough to have two. My mother's father, my grandfather, was just an amazing man, and I always wanted to be like him. He was one of these guys, son of a sharecropper, grew up in the hills of Kentucky, and hunted for his own food, and he was just an amazing fella. And having role models, at least one like that, and somebody who cares, at least one like that, is so important. So did you go to multiple elementary schools or just?
I did change schools 3 times. I think I had a teacher. I got into a gifted program in 2nd grade, and that changed everything for me. At some point, somebody told me I was smart, and I thought I should try to live up to that. So I did, and I think it's also an interesting observation because, I think that children are very malleable at that age. And so I don't know whether or not but for that teacher and but for that intervention, where I would have ended up.
So you're in elementary school, you go to high school. What were you thinking at that age? I mean, that's when you're sort of coming into your own and developing your own sense of self and future. What were you thinking in high school?
By the time I got to high school, I had worked probably since I was about 10. I had like a paper route. And then when I was 12, I was able to get certified as a babysitter. I was a hustler. Like I had really decided that I wanted to be able to always take care of myself. I wasn't really sure. I think in high school, it was still that time where people would get bullied. I was very awkward and being poor and wearing hand-me-downs. And, so I kind of just kept my head down, tried to do my best and just worked. And I didn't really know what I was going to do. I knew that I had no college money. My dad had asked my brother and I, in all of his infinite wisdom, at 12, if we wanted our college money or if we wanted a pool. Of course, we decided that we didn't need the college money. And so
that is such an unfair question. That is an unfair question. Oh my goodness.
But we did have a nice pool for a number of years. So I ended up going to, in high school, I actually started dating my now husband. I decided he
Oh,
was a
wow.
good catch and hung on to him. And by the time I was done with high school, I felt I was working at Wells Fargo. I was the head kind of salesperson their flex teller program. It
Gotcha.
was
Yeah.
I just was, again, I was good. I like to talk to people. I went to a junior college. And then from there, because it was what I could afford, I lived
Right.
in Section 8 housing at that time. Like I wanted to go into healthcare. I never would have dreamed about being a medical doctor. Like that was too aspirational because nobody in my
Yeah.
family had ever gone to college. By that time, my brother had been kicked out of school. He was
Hmm.
very deeply into a drug addiction, which he shared with my mother. So I didn't really have a lot of like outside support. And so I just kind of, again, I just leaned into the school. I did really well. And I got a full ride scholarship to UC Davis out
Nice.
of that.
Yeah.
So I ended up not having to need the money. So the pool was okay after all.
The pool turned out to be the right decision. How about that?
Right. Right. A little extra work, but that's okay.
Yeah, no kidding. And so UC Davis, you knew you wanted to go into healthcare. Was it, did you think about behavioral health all along? Was that part of the mix, or how did you wind up with your major? If I remember correctly, what was
Psychology.
your psychology, BS in psychology? How did you choose that?
So I started out as a nursing major. And when I was in, Northern California, fun fact, there's a lot of country out there where I was going to junior college, and they would bring in roadkill. And so that was our anatomy work. And of course, myself being the studious person, I would always get myself right up front. And one day, the valve on the lab, they were connected to a brachia, or no, was that no bronchia, right? Like of some sort of, it was a cat, and it exploded in my face with tissue all over me. And I instantly threw up and was mortified and embarrassed, and then proceeded to pass out. And so I decided that maybe I'm not really cut out for the actual part that I wanted so desperately to be a part of. So that is when I actually changed over to psychology, because it was easy. I loved it. I loved learning about it. It was fascinating to me, the different typologies of people. I started probably, trying to figure out my own life, right? In that sense too. Yeah. It was helpful. So that's how I switched over to psychology. And then kind of the opportunities they started presenting themselves. I think I'm a hard worker. Professors would grab me, bring me into research. They would make suggestions. I worked in a receiving home where CPS had taken children that were homeless, and it's a very filled life of service, really, in that area.
Yeah. From Cal Davis, you did something very, very interesting, and I'm curious about how you wound up studying a combination of law and psychology. So you have a JD, which is not something you list behind your name regularly or anything like that. But you're a lawyer. Why did you pursue that combined degree in law, and you ended up getting a PhD in psychology? If I'm remembering correctly, it was at Villanova and Drexel. Is
Correct.
that right?
Yeah.
So talk to me about that. How did that happen?
So I had a professor, Dr. Horn. I was at UC Davis, that was a mentor to me. I had worked at that time. I was leading a team of 16 students for a family that had 4 autistic children, 3 that were at the time, we weren't talking about spectrum disorder, but it was, there still obviously was that scope. And so we had what would have previously been considered Asperger all the way to like a mute autistic child. And so I led 16 students. I was the lead therapist. I was trained through the UCLA LOVAS program. The program was called Families for Early Autism Treatment. And so I got into this world of advocating for some of the children. 2 of the children needed to be mainstreamed, but they needed to be protected in that. Some of the kids needed some advocacy in terms of like, how do we get this family services? Like they literally needed, 17 hours a day of somebody coming in and working with these children. And so I would bounce ideas off of her and tell her kind of my woes of managing college students and having them show up. And she said, you should consider doing this law psychology degree because you're really good at helping and seeing through the cracks of policy and figuring out, kind of where those pieces need to come together. And at the time, I was naive enough not to really know what that meant. And so I just applied and had to take a bunch of tests, obviously, like the LSAT, the GRE Psych, and then had to score a certain level. And that program took 5 students a year. So I had to kind of bash my way in to get there.
It reminds me of something that I've used as a principle in my life, and that is say yes whenever you can to opportunities to learn and grow. It sounds like somebody said, "Hey, what about psychology and law?" And you said yes.
Right.
Let's do that. And from there, you also had some interesting assignments. I know one of the things that you studied, I think, was child abduction. Is that right?
That's actually once I got to Drexel, I applied for an honors internship program through the FBI. I had done the summer previous, I'd worked in Congress. I thought like maybe being a legislative assistant would be a cool idea to see how that works, which was quite eye-opening. And then the following summer is when I got with the FBI's honors intern program, it's an incredible program for anybody who has kids that are in that college age, where they pick one student from every state, and those students are assigned a different division at the bureau. So you could have been assigned, taking pictures at headquarters for people who are touring next to the flag. I was assigned into an off-site division called NCAVC, which National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime. And my unit was called CASCU, Child Abduction Serial Killer Unit. And so I was with all the profilers in this kind of undescript off building in Quantico. And that's where I got, kind of a front row seat of some really incredible trainings through BAU and some joint task force with NSA, Secret Service. So it was a very, very, I guess, fairy tale kind of existence for someone who's interested and fascinated with the mind and how people operate.
How long did you do that? Was that for a year that you were assigned to that role?
So an honors intern program is it's over a summer. You actually got paid. It was really super exciting. I think I got $700 a month. I was very excited to make some money at that. And then at the end of my work, I did homicidal pedophilia was my assignment. And I was assigned one of my mentors, Gene Rubala. We're still good friends today. He was school place violence. And when I was there, unfortunately, the Columbine tragedy happened. My work had stood out over the summer at the time it was Louis Freeh, Director Freeh. Columbine happened. They were starting to profile that case, and that's where I really saw the nexus between psychology and technology, and really the foreshadowing of what was going to happen. And I happened to be at a space where Louis Freeh at the time had asked me to be, he wanted me to stay on to do child abduction. Hospitals had not gotten the system down. Women were getting abducted prior to even getting to the hospital in parking lots. And he was just a very family-oriented man. And he said, I want somebody to dive into this and tell me how and why these women are getting abducted and these babies stolen. So that's how I was there for almost 7 years, if you count my honors intern program and to the completion of my dissertation.
Wow. So you lived some of the hardships that we hear about all the time, and then you studied, the darkest of the dark underbelly of our society. Did that leave a mark, I guess, is the way that I would say that?
Well, I mean, my husband and I did not have children for 16 years. I was completely terrified that I could not keep them safe.
Yeah.
We were both in school for a really long time. I just remember waking up one day and him looking at me and like, you're getting kind of old. If we're going to have kids, we should do it. And I thought, oh my God, like where did the time go? So at 35 is when I had my first child, but it was really that terrifying, can I do this better than I had before? And can I create a safe environment for these kids, knowing in the real world and in this virtual world that I saw coming?
That's the next step I'd like to explore a little bit, because you have become an expert on the impact of technology and technology addiction, particularly with regards to kids. How did that interest develop? Was it out of that program? And you have to be sort of an autodidact to some extent to learn about that, because it wasn't a thing at the time that you were taking it up. So talk to us about that. How did that evolve?
It did evolve from that time there, and seeing what was being sent and recorded online through vis-a-vis these two shooters at Columbine. One definitely more prolific than the other, and also my ability to tour. Even back then, it was the internet had just been deregulated by Congress, so it was no longer just a military platform, and they started to come up with some of the early programs that were coming out. And so, what I got to see was headquarters. I could walk in and I could see 100 agents sitting behind kind of rows of desks, all of them imitating a child under the age of 15, and having these intense conversations with people that were trying to get them to send them things or do things. And it was so disturbing and so scary. But it was also, to me, I'm somebody who, like, as I go through life, if there's a need or something's broken, I don't know if it's my superpower, if it's my tenacity, if it's my stubbornness. I don't know what it is, but I was like, I knew that was going to need help there. And it's been an uncomfortable, unrewarding at times, kind of bleeding edge field, because I've been called Chicken Little, and you're taking this too serious, and I keep saying, like, this is going to consume our children, and it is going to change this path of generation. So I hate that to be right in a lot of the things that I said early on, but that's how I got in. It's just pure kind of grit and passion.
Do you think we've made any progress, or do you think we're still in the middle of the belly of the beast, if you will, with regards to technology and kids?
I feel a little bit like we're in the center of the eye of the hurricane right now. I think it was pretty rough getting to this point. I think things are quiet now, and I think they're quiet now because the tech industry is starting to get pushback. We're still not asking the right questions of them. They're still not giving the right answers, even though they know the questions we should be asking. And I think that the population of parents are getting more educated in my, kind of my little world of, going out and giving speeches and trying to educate people. I think that they're starting to understand it, and they're tired of living this kind of secret life of where their children are online too much.
You are actively practicing now, is that correct?
Yes.
What do you do in your practice? Do you see all comers? Do you just focus on that issue? How do you structure your active practice today?
So I'm generally a clinical psychologist. I see teenagers, adults, and couples. It's been 18 years. I hate giving how many years it is. I feel like I can pretend like I'm not as old as I am when I don't.
People start doing math.
I know. Yeah. It does help when you do two degrees at the same time. So you can kind of condense your educational world. Yeah. But anyway, I do see all of them. To me, that it's not possible anymore today to untangle the influence of our technical world from our real world, because it is so ubiquitous. The average age in the United States, a child has a first device is now 6. Average age first pornographic viewing begins now at 8, and chronic viewing begins at 11. So chronic viewing at 11, you're looking at fifth graders, right? So, my, kind of the time I was actually called out for, you're just coming out here and giving us a lot of scary statistics. They're not my statistics, right? This is like the CDC. This is Pew Internet. I'm not making them up.
Yeah.
I talk to everyone, but everybody has some sort of influence in their life, whether it's a relationship that they're trying to get through will be impacted some way by how they're communicating. And we use our technology now to communicate, as you know, for the majority of the time. So how do we teach ourselves to use it wisely and in moderation and as a tool so that it's not using us?
Yeah. I feel fortunate that there wasn't an internet. And, when I was growing up, that there was no internet, that there was no, nobody was taking pictures of everything that I did. I wasn't tempted to do those things because it just didn't exist. I joked with my kids that when I was born, there were 48 states, and I started learning how to do calculus on a slide rule. And both are true, but it's such a different world now. I mean, it has been transformed by technology, and the statistics you're sharing are just they're sobering. I mean, they really are. And I wonder, do you make recommendations to parents about how to manage that with their kids? I mean, is it something you say, kids shouldn't have a device until age X, or is it trying to get them to use it responsibly? How do you address this? It's so ubiquitous.
So I've written a couple books. I wrote
that's right.
The first one, Unplug, which is like 100 pages, and it was kind of me mind dumping, like here's some like quick facts and things that you can do as a parent, technology use logs, like how do you kind of start from the beginning. My dad called it a pamphlet, so I promptly went and started a second book just to prove him that I'm wrong. Not that I'm competitive or anything.
No, nothing like that.
Yeah. And the book that I released right during COVID was that one is called Digital Distress. And that one is really on the whole Gen Z population. So it really goes from like kind of the antithesis of like where we thought we wanted to be and where we are. And we talk about how I wrote it with a co-author, Dr. Westendorf. She went through the JD PhD program with me, and I've known her for years. And she and I talked about this, and I said, this is just a new generation. Like they have not, to your point, they've never not had Google, right? So they've never not had some kind of a higher authority that they could just talk in and get answers to. And which means it changes us as parents. It changes us as educators. It changes us as administrators and professionals in the field, because we're getting this new generation into the workforce. We had to learn about, Ponce de Leon and Sir Francis Drake and, all of the different explorers and what they did and how our global, world history is developed. And they really need more of a training now in like access to knowledge and how do we filter through sources, and is that a good source or not a good source? But for us to pretend like they're the same beings as we are, that we're completely trained differently and our brains were developed differently. That's what that second book really talks about.
And the name of that book is
Digital Distress.
You and I set this up pretty quickly recently, and it was only after I started digging in that I found that you were an author and a speaker and an expert on this topic, and was just really fascinated by the whole thing. And gosh, what you've done in a very short period of time for a career is really amazing. Now, how did the speaking evolve? What happened? Did somebody reach out to you and say, "Hey, I read Unplugged and I'd like you to come on CNN"? I mean, how did that happen?
Not exactly. And it probably is a bit like our first meeting where I kind of hunted you down. I did the same with Dr. Drew Pinsky, who I had listened to for years in the world of addiction and intervention. I showed up at a speech he was giving here in town locally. I paid extra actually to do a meet and greet. And he was late by 20 minutes. I had two kids at the time under the age of 5 on 2 separate soccer fields. So I kind of blocked his entrance to this patio, and I just said, "You're behind schedule, and my kids have soccer in 10 minutes. So I'm just going to get right to the point, and I need your help in the world of technology addiction." And he looked at me, and he very casually looked down at my purse, and he said, "Do you have technology with you? Because I can give you some numbers." And he just basically gave me the number of his producer, and he put me on HLN, and kind of after that, it was that's how the media piece started. And the speaking was just, that's pure. I've got information that others need. And I suppose I'm naive enough to think that I can get on stage and have those conversations with people.
Yeah. Well, obviously you can, because they've asked for more. You have one of the most fascinating stories that I've encountered, and one of the things that I said when I started this podcast, The Groves Connection, was that I was going to have patients on too. And do you want to talk a little bit about how you and I met? Share whatever you want to about that, and then we'll go a little bit deeper.
Well, so how I actually came to know of you is I was in a really frustrating place. So I was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was, just a personal exam. I was in a shower. I actually thought nothing of it. And I actually brought in my 14-year-old daughter, and I said, this is what you should be actually looking for. I'm sure it's nothing. I'll go get it checked out. And then when I went and got it checked out, despite the fact that I had a clear mammogram, I think it was 11 months earlier, I had a pretty sizable tumor. And I, within 4 weeks of that time, had gone from the biopsy. I was very fortunate. I went to a imaging center that had a mammogram, an ultrasound, and a biopsy all in the same day. And so I was very well taken care of in that regard, because it didn't have to go through weeks of kind of waiting for all of those processes to happen. And once I knew, kind of found a surgeon, interviewed 3. It was the process was exhausting, and being married to someone who's a doctor, it just seemed like an uphill battle. It was, this friend thinks you should go to this cancer center, this friend should go there. And even in one instance, I ended up going to Ironwood Cancer Centers here, and they've been absolutely amazing. I had a friend who said, well, I think it's called the American Cancer Center. I can't remember the title, but I couldn't find anyone at the time who could do an MRI, a breast MRI. They either didn't have contrast, or they didn't have workers. And, you have to remember, this is at the tail end of COVID. So,
right.
So it was a very frustrating process. And when I was this major cancer entity, and I said to my husband, I said, well, it looks like Oliver, a friend of ours, had pulled some strings, and I can go down there. And my husband, out of exasperation as a doctor, said, well, that's going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars, Lisa. And both of my kids heard that. And if there's words that he could unsay, right? Because at that time, my kids were like, this isn't, but it became right. Like that, this isn't just about getting yourself healthy. It's about, can you afford to get yourself healthy? And what is the path to do that? That's when I don't usually vent. But I think at some point I went through the surgery, and then the recommendation for radiation through, people may not know this, but you have 3 separate doctors. You have a surgeon, a medical oncologist, and you have a radiation oncologist. The radiation oncologist was suggesting a course of treatment, and it wasn't approved.
Let me stop you for just a second, because the entity that didn't approve it was Banner Aetna, right?
Yes.
And that's the insurance company that I work for. So that's the link there. But all right, go ahead with your description of why.
Right. So again, like, I'm a patient. I don't know anything. This radiation specialist, who is this lovely woman, Dr. Mildenberger, who has been doing it for 40 plus years, she said, well, what I would like to do is this radiation treatment that would arc around so that we're not impacting your heart, because this is your left side, and all of these things that radiation can do. And so it's quite sobering when you have a professional that you trust telling you something. And in this case, I had a surgeon and the oncology radiation department telling me that. And then I had my insurance company that said, no, we're not going to pay for it. And I literally went through the process of asking how much it would cost. Can I afford to do this to save that heart? I have asthma as well. And so there's pulmonary concerns. Like, it's already, a challenge for me in some ways. And that's when I started stalking you. I think I hunted you down, but I put in all my friends, right? Like, I put this post up and I tagged Fox, CNN, MSNBC, and Banner Aetna. And so, I don't know if it was the power of the media or if it was, me putting this post out and literally having a patient respond to me and say, I used to be, this woman said, my wife used to be the CMO at Banner, and the people that are in that role really want to do good. Have you tried reaching out to whoever the CMO is? And that's when I directly went over and said, I'm going to go try to find this person. And that was you.
For those who haven't been through this, and increasingly, unfortunately, more and more people have been through the prior authorization process, and including those of us who run the show, so to speak. I was fascinated with you were talking earlier about your husband being a physician. That used to mean something, and it's not good necessarily, but it used to mean you had some privilege, some insight into how to get things done. And anymore, it is just impossible. It has become a very large machine that we call healthcare in the U.S. And in this country, we have both undertreatment and overtreatment. And prior auth arose out of this insight, if you will, that if one limits overtreatment, then one can limit the total cost of care. Now, you can argue about how well we've done with that. It seems like no matter what we do, costs go up every year. So how much is it limiting? I don't know. The other conundrum is that, the insurance companies, ours included, will say, well, this is based on the evidence. But then every insurance company comes to a slightly different decision looking at the same evidence. And so it really is very, very messy. But talk to us about what it's like. You've had a life-threatening diagnosis psychologically. What is it like to be in that bardo, in that in-between place where you're looking at, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars that you may have to come up with while you're trying to get this done. And there's a clock ticking in your head, I'm sure. Absolutely. It's like, I need this treated. I want it treated now. I want this out. I want this done. And to describe radiation therapy very briefly for those of you who may not be, and I'm going to be very simplistic here, but radiation therapy is literally radiation directed at the residual tumor. So this is after surgery. Radiation is designed to make sure that all the tumor is killed. Well, it's not very discriminatory. Radiation kills normal tissue just like it kills cancer tissue. And unless it's very carefully focused, there's collateral damage. And there's an older way of doing this that is less expensive. And then there's this newer way, and there are several of them that you were talking about, that can fine-tune the radiation beam such that it spares much more of the heart and lungs. Now, the argument then becomes on the managed care side. Well, nobody has ever shown that makes any difference, whether you do it the old-fashioned way or the newfangled way. But as an individual, you're thinking to yourself, I don't care. What I want is, the best chance of living a long and prosperous life. And if you tell me that there's this one option that will completely spare, maximally spare my heart and lungs, and there's this other option where and knock off a few cells here and there, but we don't think it's important. What are you going to choose? And that's the place that we put you in.
Right. Correct. And it's not just where it put me into it, because I think, in my world, I'm the patient that came in on Wednesdays for radiation, and I called Wacky Wednesday, and I'd bring stuff from the dollar stores for all the people in the radiation center. And on Fridays, I made it Fun Friday, and I'd bring cookies and cupcakes and some sort of treat. And it's a very morose world there. They're dealing with very sick people, and I'm a psychologist, and I was like, these people need lifting up. And what I found, and what my frustration was, because I did end up paying cash ahead to start the treatment, banking on or hoping, right, that something would happen. But I said, I don't want to stop. Like, I don't want to take any risk or chances. And so we had a credit card that had like a high limit, and I was like, we'll just put it here and we'll see what happened. But with the situation specific to me, there's this independent company. I think it's called Omnicore Corp. You might know the name of it, but it's a third party used by Banner Aetna, that they were the ones that would like interface with me. I wouldn't directly be talking to anyone at Banner Aetna. They were, I think the nomenclature at the cancer center is Evil Corp, because what they would do is to put those folks, right? So these people are at this, this beautiful building, trying to help people get through this as easily as they possibly can. And the reality was that that system is putting them in a place where I have folks from this Ironwood Cancer Center calling me and saying, I have some bad news for you. And then I, on one hand, have a choice in how I respond to that. And do I respond to them with like anger and frustration and fear and all of the things that you have? Or do you take a second and say, oh my gosh, like the hurt and the calls that you have to make. And I had a conversation with this woman, and she said, I make 25 to 30 of these calls a day, and I have to let people know that their insurance isn't going to do what needs to be done. And I just thought, oh my gosh, this poor woman. I actually bought her a bracelet and brought it to her office and gave it to her and just said, hang in there. Like, we need you. And you don't deserve probably the behavior that you get from people. But that's the truth, that particularly in this area of where people are scared and they're fearful. And so the psychology of that is just really, really fascinating, because you don't have a predictable response with people.
The decisions that are made around prior authorization can be very different depending, especially on appeal or a provider to provider conversation, can be very different depending on who's on that day and how they interpret the conversation, the literature, the position of the company, all of those things. And so it's somewhat arbitrary. It feels almost like a random event in some ways. The principles, I understand them, and they're actually quite sound if you could figure out how to do the knowledge management on the front end. And one of the things that we're trying to do at Banner Aetna now is to say, look, why are we waiting until after a study is scheduled and the patient has left the office to say, we're not going to pay for it? Why can't we put the knowledge up front so that patient and physician can, in real time, know whether it's been approved or not? And if it's not, you can instantly then take action to say, no, this is an exception to your rule, whether it's Evacor or Aetna or anybody else, and have a real discussion in real time right then. And I think the other thing that's missed is, not to mention the human toll that this takes in stress. I mean, the last thing you need is more stress at a time like that in your life. But it's an incredibly expensive process. Mm-hmm. There are tons of nurses that are trained to do this review and all of this, back and forth. And it can take weeks, literally weeks, if not months sometimes, to get things approved. And if you're sitting there with a diagnosis of cancer, that is excruciating. And so we have had a couple of goes at trying to address the prior authorization process, and we continue to work on it. And we will do something in that arena as soon as we can dislodge some of the vested interest in the status quo. And that's really what it boils down to. And that's the problem with much of our healthcare system. I mean, people say 30% of it is waste. Well, that's somebody's job too, and that's somebody's company. And there are all these interests that are competing for the healthcare dollar now. And it just drives prices up for everybody. I do want to say that as a practicing physician, it was incredibly frustrating to believe that I needed this specific thing on this specific patient, and then to be told, no, I'm sorry. And it is predictable in that circumstance that the insurance company is going to get the brunt of the ire, and in my opinion, should at this point, because we've got to do a better job of addressing this.
I think it was fortuitous in our first conversation that you happened to be at a conference for breast cancer, I think.
Yeah,
that's true. So, right. Yeah. And so what your listeners should hear is, for some reason, I was able to come to you, or you had some sort of gift that day, and you just said, here's my cell phone, call me. And I thought, wow, that you were like an angel to me that day, because I was in that place of how do I and where do I go in that moment? And you're like, I happen to be here with a bunch of these people that do this for a living, and I'm going to start asking questions. So,
yeah. Oh my gosh. I had forgotten that, but you're absolutely right. I was sitting there next to 3 radiation oncologists, one from Johns Hopkins, one from Stanford, and another from Yale, I think. I mean, it was like a who's who in radiation oncology. So I was in the catbird seat in terms of getting questions answered, because it's impossible. I frequently say 50 years, in 1950, it took 50 years for medical knowledge to double. Now it's measured in weeks and months. And there is no one on earth who can keep up with all of that. We need artificial intelligence to help us manage that knowledge. But I had repositories of knowledge right there sitting next to me in the conference room. We were on break. And so I spent a great deal of time talking to those folks and finding out what the scoop was. And it was clear to me that you had a case, that absolutely this is something we ought to revisit. And so that's what we did. I mean, it wasn't easy, but ultimately we got it done. And I'm so glad that I was there to help for that. And by the way, I offer that to anybody who wants to get in contact with me, and I'm not hard to find, apparently. So those of you who are out there who might be struggling with an issue, feel free to contact me as well. How did that color the rest of your therapy or your notions of U.S. healthcare? I mean, what did that do? Had you ever been in a situation requiring prior authorization before, or is that your first exposure to it?
No, that was it was my first exposure to it. Obviously, my husband, who is he was a Mayo doc, now in private practice, but he has to go through that a lot. So he was kind of, shepherding and telling me, like, well, it just has to go in, and they have to look at it, and they'll say yes or no, but then it'll go back on appeal, and it's just the game we play, and then it'll get approved. And in my case, it didn't. So it went in and they said no, and it came back, and then they wrote a justification, and the justification got denied. And then there was a call. So there was kind of these 3 steps. And then there was my reach out to you, because I thought, this is insane that, you've got a consumer, and as a patient who's being told that this is really kind of your only shot at not creating like mass, kind of collateral damage in their body. Yeah. And so it was scary, and it was hard to understand that. And so whatever that process is, and why and how it goes in, and how you have these doctors that weigh in, I can't imagine that's easy to address or fix. But certainly, I guess the communication or the sharing of that process and making it a more human response is probably what I would say is missing, because there's no human touch points in that.
Yeah, and you get a form letter essentially,
or you get this poor lady, somebody from a treatment center that's trying to help you saying,
"Sorry,
hey, listen, I'm really sorry." Yeah. In my case, but I suspect most of the time you just get a letter that says no.
Yeah, that's true. And it's a form letter, and it has all of the legalese required, which makes it even more impersonal.
In my case, I think I actually got a recording. I think I saved it. I can't remember if I sent it to you or not, from Eva Corp.
Yeah, you did.
And I was like, really, it was just it was almost like a serial killer had patched together separate like voices and like strung them together in denial of chunking these like different like pieces together.
That's a great description. Yeah.
How to get better than this.
There are so many things like that in the system that sometimes you just look at it and it can be overwhelming. I remember when I first got into Banner Aetna, we had a mom that had taken her kid to the emergency department, and child had asthma and was in a pretty significant flare and spent, close to 24 hours in the ED. No, I'm sorry. The child was in the hospital for about 24 hours, and she got a letter saying that payment for hospitalization was not approved. And the form letter looks the same no matter the reason. And the reason in this case was because we didn't have all the information yet. And once we had all the information, it was a slam dunk. But, there's no explanation. There's no we're waiting for more information. And so we actually revised the letter to say what was really going on. And you have no idea how difficult that was because of the legal perspective that, oh, no, we can't say this, we can't say that, we can't do it this way, it has to be the form so that we are compliant with all the regs and rules, et cetera. But you're right, the human element, what patients care about most every time it's been looked at is caring. That's what they value. And that's what I'd value. I mean, I understand that it's complicated, and I understand that sometimes I won't get what I want, but I want to know that somebody cares and that they're on my side, not that I'm just some sort of cog in the wheel. And that's how it feels with those form letters. There's no doubt. So, how are you doing now?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm 1 year out. I had a clear scan. There is actually, ironically, I just yesterday went in and there's some potential radiation side effects on the skin that I'll have to go and like have that reviewed. But other than that, I'm here for a reason and a purpose. And so I just, I take care of things as they come and figure we'll get through it. So
do you think that your childhood experiences, fending for yourself, clawing your way through life, impacted the way you addressed this problem when you encountered it? It's not what most people do.
It's interesting. I've got a friend who, actually a colleague, he's a Navy SEAL, and my nickname is Alley Cat in his phone. He's like, you got a little street in you, Strohman. And I think that that's true. I think, I am polished. I'm educated now. I could never, and as a child, you asked me this question earlier and I thought, I didn't say it, but I had never imagined living past 20. I never thought that I would make it out of that kind of life and childhood. So every day to me is a gift and every day is an opportunity. And so I do think that I fight for those people that don't have it in them or don't know how, because I was afforded some of these gifts and nothing that I did to, help me deserve it more than anyone else. And so I do think that that's what, to me, I don't accept no. It's like, I'm curious when people try to say no, but I'll figure it out.
What do you mean no? Yeah. That's not a word I recognize.
Right. And I don't accept that.
I appreciate that about you. And the fact that you're using your life to try and help others address very challenging problems. I would be remiss if I didn't explore a little bit with you what's your perspective on the pandemic? How has that impacted our social fabric? We can talk about politics too, but where are we as a nation? I mean, what is your hope, your fear?
I think that from a global psychological perspective, I think that people were unsettled, and the scope of what we expect, effort in, reward out, changed. I think that from a healthcare perspective, I saw nurses through the pandemic at no cost to them, as a service back, because they were drowning. Quite frankly, I had a nurse that had been out 18 months from nursing school, and she was put in an ICU COVID unit, and she was bagging 10 to 15 patients a day. And she's in her early 20s. There's the humanity in that exposure was a lot. And I think that is going to take at least probably a decade to recover from that perspective of, whether or not we have the resources to respond, whether or not we'll always understand how to respond. You can't really take lessons from, I think it was the Spanish flu that was in the early 1900s. And we were trying, right? We were trying to get all of those lessons, but doctors that normally were very effective, particularly in your field, pulmonologists and things like that. I had a nurse that she's like, I think he's going to quit. Like, I think he's not going to come back because it didn't make sense. Somebody who he thought was going to go home, died within 48 hours, and somebody who he thought was going to die, is still walking around today. So, the psychology of not that trauma response, usually you need people. So if you think about a grief, the Kubler-Ross stages of grief,
right,
in trauma responses are very similar. The difference is, in a trauma, what we need is connection, and we need somebody to come forward. So if you see somebody hurt, it's easier with a young child to imagine this for the listeners. Yeah. But if a child falls down on a playground, your instant reaction is to go over and help them up because they're hurting. And so the pandemic isolated us by force in this global fashion. And so there was no going towards someone when they were hurting. We were trained that it was unsafe. It was unsafe to be near someone because we did not know or trust. And whether or not they believed in masking or vaccines or all of that came through in a way that created a psychological shift with one another in our society. And that's going to take a while to fix. And it's going to take a while to read trust again and come together again.
You said a decade. I'm wondering if it's not a generation. This is really a big hit. And it comes at a time when healthcare is already reeling, collapsing under the weight of its own complexity, essentially. And, I think a big part of physician burnout is what we were talking about earlier. It's that alienation. We are judged by metrics alone now, and when you narrow somebody down to a set of numbers, and it crushes intrinsic motivation, which is what doctors and other caregivers thrive on. I mean, we, for the most part, most caregivers got into it because they want to give care, and instead they've become clerks and numbers. And I used to be a huge fan of incentives for value-based care. I'm no longer in that camp. I think that the best idea for physicians is, either population-based payment or salary, because I think the temptation is too strong in either direction. That at the margin decisions are made that are not in the patient's best interest, and this can happen to good people. I mean, we are often not aware of our predispositions and our biases. And so the best way to ensure that they don't influence us is to eliminate them, eliminate that temptation to do more in fee for service or to do less in value-based payments. And the incentive is really perverse in value-based payment that's based on fee for service, because you're incentivized to both do more and less. More people, less for each one is the formula that wins in fee-for-service based value-based care, if you will.
It's not sustainable for either side.
No, it's really not, and it's not what I went into healthcare for, and that's been the driver for me, is how do we fix this? I would love to get you listen to your husband and you have your own exposure now to our system. The deprioritization of the human element of care, I see as a fundamental flaw in the current system, medicine 2.0 or whatever you want to call it. What do you think the primary issue is? How have we gotten here, and what do we do to fix it?
I think to your point about doctors, I think I have a unique view because I'm married to one. I saw him through residency. At Mayo, who doesn't allow, they didn't allow pharmaceutical companies in. They didn't allow any of the things that, I think to your point can sway decision making, and they really focused training them on doctoring and showing up for people, which was interesting. That from the outside looking at my husband, he's a human. Right. He had patients that died. He had patients that he had to deliver. And still to this day, he came home on Monday and said, I had to tell a patient they had cancer. I said, how was your day? He said, I had to tell someone that they have cancer. Yeah. And I just gave him a hug and I said, I'm sorry. And, he moved out of fee-based services because they were not successful. They could not see enough patients. He had 3,500 patients on his panel. He was the most stressed I'd ever seen him. And he said to me, I cannot keep track from a algorithmic perspective to make sure every person I'm suggesting go get this test or go do this. I cannot keep up. And he went from 3,500 patients, I believe, down to 300, 280, I think he's got as a concierge doc. And he has time to visit his patients. He has time to have conversations with his patients. He has time to have a relationship with them, which makes sometimes it harder. But I think that part of it is recognizing that just because somebody has an MD or somebody's in the insurance company doesn't mean that they're not human and they don't have families too. I think that we have to start there of trying to explain that, we're doing our best. Here's where this is a point for me because I am X, right? I'm a dad or I'm a husband or I'm this, and sharing that and understanding that they're there to help and they're trying their very best and recognizing that piece, I think, is the part that we just look at it as kind of a big, the medicine world or the insurance world is a big, entity to not respect. And if you look at it that way, that's true. But if you break it apart and you look at it and say, okay, there are broken pieces, but the people inside that are moving those broken pieces maybe would want those pieces to be fixed. And maybe we should humanize that a little bit and let them have a little bit more power in that.
I am so glad that you raised that point, because I too believe that for the most part, in every corner of healthcare, there are good people that are doing their job, following the incentives as they are today. And the system is fragmented and it's designed to deliver exactly what we're getting. And it was designed as a kludge more than anything else, it's glom this on top of that and et cetera. But you're absolutely right. I've met some of my favorite people. My boss, for example, is amazing. And he's been, in the insurance world for 30 years. But he's an amazing human being. He understands where the flaws are, and he he works hard to fix them. But it's tough once you get all of these entrenched industries in place. And, as I mentioned, when you say, let's cut all the waste out of healthcare, well, 1 in 8 jobs in this country now is in healthcare. And if we cut healthcare costs, that impacts real people too. So, it's a very difficult equation to navigate, extremely difficult. But I noticed that I have a dear friend that I went to medical school with that is now in concierge medicine as a family doc, and it has been transformational for him. I mean, I talked to him. He sounds so much happier. He's healthier. He's got the fire again. About helping people and being there for them, and he has the time to develop relationship. And guess what? If you're trying to influence behavior towards health, it's hard to do that if you don't have a relationship. That's what makes the world go round. And 10 minutes is not enough. It's just not enough. So I'm glad that your husband has found something that works for him. I mean, concierge medicine gets criticized because, well, what do you do about this or that? But here's the bottom line. What concierge medicine has done for us is shown us that we've gotten it wrong because patients are happier in a concierge program. Physicians are happier in a concierge program. And, that's been pretty well documented. How do we afford it is the question, because it doesn't help somebody who's going to a federally qualified health center, right? And that's the challenge, is how do we scale panel size essentially and still allow physicians who sacrifice so much to get where they are, often go into profound debt to get where they are. How do we make it right by them to make sure that they're fairly and adequately compensated for what they do without these perverse incentives? And that's the real challenge before us. I don't know what all the it's interesting. I used to think that I knew how to fix healthcare, and the complexity that I see now is I'm not sure that we get there without some sort of crisis, and that is fast approaching, I think.
Yeah, I think it's going to have to, education's in the same boat as healthcare. And I think that,
yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that and I've said this to people, I'm like, unfortunately, I said, like, watching it kind of crash and burn, it might be better to start fresh than to try to save the entity. And how do you repurpose and reinvigorate people that have given their life to this? And I think, but yeah, like it is a significant amount of money to get those degrees. And it's twice what it was when we went through 20 years ago. So that's where I think that the crisis, I think what you're intimating is we're going to have less people going into the field if we don't figure it out faster, because it's not going to be rewarding.
In droves. Mm-hmm. When I went to medical school, I went in state, and it was $6,000 a semester. And I look at that, at the prices that are being charged today for medical school, particularly at some of the marquee programs. And unless you are, independently wealthy, the debt is crushing. Mm-hmm. And to say all of a sudden that, you trained for this and we're going to take that away from you, that's a tough one too. So it's going to be an interesting ride here for, as you said, the next decade and perhaps the next generation. Yeah. What I'd like to do now is spend a little bit of time asking you, how do folks find you if they want to see you professionally, if they want to see your work, if they want to get your books? How do they find you?
Probably the easiest way is just to go to asklisa.com. That takes them to my Dr. Lisa Strohman site. And I think everything that they would need is there. So I'm a little bit like you. I keep myself open. If people have questions or they need help or direction, if they write me there, every single one of those come to me, and I try to answer and respond to all of them.
Yeah, good. appreciate that. AskLisa.com. How did you get that? That's a great.
Well, that's my, I think my little hidden addiction is like buying URLs. Like back in the day, it was like thinking what would be good. And I had this dream of starting a program that, I'm like remotely able to help people. And so, so that's how it got started.
Well, we are so lucky that you are in the world and doing the good work that you do. And I really appreciate you and am in awe of what you've accomplished, particularly with the barriers I learned about today that you've overcome. So thank you so much for being Lisa Strohman, JD, PhD, and for using those talents to help people. I mean, it's an amazing story, and I really appreciate you and the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you for having me on. And as I have told you before, if there's anything I can do to help, or even if there's a frustrating day, you know how to get a hold of me.
Anything else? Any final words you'd like to share? Or?
Yeah, I hope that the listeners really share all of your podcasts, share who you are, because it is a gift to find someone like you that actually is willing to take this on and try to fix it. So thank you for that. And I hope that you do get some bandwidth with that, because I know how hard that uphill battle can be.
Well, thank you very much. And with that, we are going to say so long.
You've been listening to The Groves Connection, your connection to the inside story on healthcare, featuring in-depth interviews with those who know. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, give us a 5-star review to keep the connection going, and hit the subscribe button to be sure you never miss a beat. The Groves Connection is produced by Dr. Robert Groves. Original music, editing, and creative direction provided by Alden Groves. Production support, content guidance, courtesy of Janae Sharp and Elizabeth Barrett. Thank you for listening. The professional ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast are mine and do not reflect those of any current or past employers. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time on The Groves Connection.